this is the danger. Two things. One is they are truly addicted to this. And there's two forms of addiction that I've discovered with these patients. Well, not me discovered it, but through experience. Firstly, there's the psychological aspect that you've become Pavlovian. You come home and the first thing you want to do is gorge on some junk food. Okay, it's a Pavlovian. It's that house. It's that kitchen. It's that sofa. It's sometimes getting into your car that you dig for something. So we need to get rid of that Pavlovian reflex. So I tell patients, okay, when do you eat? What stimulates your thought about food? What makes you crave for it? Is it certain friends that make you do it, or a certain environment that do it? So those are all psychological cues, and then the second part of it is the true chemical addiction, which I do believe that is really true, because these processed foods, especially sugar is number one. It goes to the dopamine center. And now all of a sudden, the next time you eat sugar, you need more and more of it. And there's cravings. But you know what? Worse than the cravings, I have to point this out. Worse than the cravings are the fact that it changes your brain completely. There's actual neuronal pathway changes that occur in your brain. So when you are eating all those Oreos all the time, you've already got those pathways built into your brain, where the rostral pathways from your dopamine center and limbic system, which go to your frontal cortex, they downregulated. Now, what does that mean? That means that when you're addicted to that type of food, you can't think straight about that food. That means you've become a little dumber about the intelligence of your diet and your control over your diet, because it wants to continue to be addicted. So you don't get so smart about it, okay? Because if you get smart, you're going to not be an addict anymore. So it makes your frontal lobe go down in its function. And then it goes to the hippocampus. So there's connections that go to the hippocampus that actually make you remember that wonderful feeling that you had when you ate 5 really bad processed food items in a matter of 1 hour. So you get that. You got to break all these down. So yes, you're absolutely right. To break those neuronal pathways and the habit pathways, you got to bring in this slowly. So I do discuss with my patients, how far are they along the path of this processed food addiction, and what is the consumption? I mean, today it's really sad that almost 57% of all the calories that they're consuming these days are coming from processed or ultra processed foods. So you got to bring that number down. So changing the content of the diet first before we even introduce fasting. I think you're very right. You got to change what they're eating first. Because if you just go straight into dieting, they will get a lot of withdrawal symptoms. And then, as I said, they're going to be so dismayed and feel so bad, they'll fall off the bandwagon. They'll never come back again. So do make the change. You got to give them alternative foods. You got to show them that these foods are the ones that are non-addictive foods that you got to get on, which is basically whole foods, real food. If it looks like that in nature, eat it. If it's going to go bad, eat it. If it's got a barcode on it, be suspicious. Don't touch it. If it's got a food label on it, be suspicious. Try not to read it or eat it. Just get rid of it. So just go for real food. So people come to me and say, you're a cardiologist, so I became a vegetarian and I don't eat meat anymore. And I was one of them that believed that meat, hey, this is bad stuff. I'm cardiology, FACC. And I realized that the research doesn't support that. So why would red meat be bad for you? It can be. And my association with that, or my interest in that, is that if it's grain-fed cows, they're going to have too much omega-6. That omega-6 is getting into you now. So that beef is not going to have the same concentration of fats of a cow that's eating grass, because that's a grass-fed cow. It'll have more omega-3 and it'll have more saturated fat in it, not the omega-6s. You see, you are what you eat and what that ate. So meat is actually okay, provided it's grass finished and thereby doesn't have all that omega-6 in it. Chicken is okay, organic chicken. And if your eggs, organic eggs. I have no problem with these foods because they are whole, they're natural. And when I put my patients on these, I guess what? I get better compliance. Because I know you can go ahead and eat your egg. Have your egg for breakfast. Just get rid of the toast. Just have your 2 eggs for breakfast. Cardiologists saying 2 eggs are fine. Yes, because the cholesterol that's in the eggs is not what's going to raise your cholesterol level. Your cholesterol is what you're making mostly in your liver. So this type of education, they feel better about it and say, Doc, let me eat eggs. He lets me eat beef. He lets me eat chicken. Yeah, but I tell them it's got to be the right stuff. And then, of course, with it, you got to have your vegetables with it. So you got to make these changes in their diet so they're eating better quality food, better classes of food in the whole state with everything, just the way nature made it. If it's like that in nature, consume it. If it went to a factory and got changed, get rid of it. That's the bottom line.
It's the bottom line, and sometimes the simplest answers still take. It's an uphill battle against the entire way that society is organized around food and pleasure, and as you've mentioned, addiction. So I want to say for anybody who's listening that is hearing this and is nodding their head along as they're listening or watching this, especially with you, Dr. J, working with patients, that there is so much past baggage that people have to let go of. Sometimes that's even trauma. Sometimes that's all sorts of different components as to, even though it's a simple answer, we know you're fighting an uphill battle. And for everybody who's listening that feels that they should be further along than they are, you're doing the best you can. And yes, there might still be changes that you want to make, and be gentle in the process, but keep on at it because you're headed in the right direction.
Yeah. Again, you are so far ahead of everyone because you understand that your eating behavior is also affected by what else is going on in your life. So if you have a job that's extremely stressful, you've had a lot of crises going on in your life, then at that point, I'm going to tell you, okay, you got to do this, and the other. It's going to be very difficult for you to do it. So when you look at dietary changes and behavioral changes in eating, you also got to look at the totality of the patient's life. How much stress is going on in his or her life? What kind of job? But now you're digging even more layers on that onion. You see what I'm saying? So you got it's so deep. It's a lifestyle. So you got to say to yourself, okay, Dr. J is not just talking to me about when to eat, how to eat, and what to eat. It's also talking to me about, am I happy? Am I peaceful? Do I have purpose? Do I have connection? Am I depressed? Because all these factors are also going to affect not only your eating habit, but also your general health. Let me give you an example. We look at the attributable risk of, let's say, hypertension or cholesterol to coronary artery disease. But have you looked at the attributable risk of things like depression? It's far worse. So if you're depressed, you're a sitting duck to have a heart attack. And nobody talks about that. They say, okay, let's look at your risk factors, or sit on here, tell me if you're depressed, you fill this form up and tell you if you're depressed. And nobody's got time to, your own family doctor doesn't have time to do that. And yet we don't realize that the attributable risk of depression and other psychological illnesses that you might actually have are far more. Do you feel connected? What's your understanding of your standing in society in general, or do you feel that you're at the bottom? Do you feel that you have confidence that you can talk with? All these things affect your physiology. So diet is one big part of it, but all these other things are so important. And I got to tell you about this one study because this will really raise your curiosity on how I got involved with this. This was a study that was done at Johns Hopkins. They took medical students and obviously paid them for the experiment. You put an arterial line in their radial artery, and they were drawing out blood and putting it through a machine that measures your platelet reactivity. Okay, right? So they can tell moment to moment, because it's done through light, as to whether the platelets are aggregating or not. So platelets, as you know, are those tiny little particles that make your blood clot, make your blood sticky, which you don't want because you want your arteries to be free-flowing. So what happened is that they gave them a test while they're doing this, and they flip through the page, they answer the questions, and the platelets are happy. And then they turn the page, and now you got a question that on a subject that you were never taught. These kids go crazy now. Oh my God, I don't know the answer. And guess what happened to the platelet reactivity? Changed
Wow.
instantaneously. This is so fascinating that and I read the study about 30 years ago, and it stuck with me. But it showed me how your moment to moment, I'm not saying long, even moment to moment perception of stress affects your physiology. This is just one example. I've got hundreds of examples I can show you of how your mental state affects your physiology and how your body reacts on a moment-to-moment basis, down to even expression of angiotensin II receptors in your endothelium and your blood vessels. So whether you're going to actually clot right now or you're going to flow, and the number of receptors that are expressed we say that we have these angiotensin II receptors in our cells, right? Yeah. So we think they're fixed. They're not. Three-quarters of them are involuted. They don't express themselves. Now, under certain circumstances, they'll all of a sudden express themselves. And that the stimulus for the expression of those receptors could be dietary, but more so, it can also be psychological, how you feel. And it's amazing to me that 50,000 receptors, now all of a sudden there are 100,000 expressing themselves. So now when the angiotensin comes along, you're going to get a hypertensive blood pressure response. Suddenly your blood pressure goes up. So we have these biochemical pathways, we know about it. But nobody's saying that, okay, fine, let's look at your diet, but also, come on, get a handle on your life. Let's decrease the stress levels. Let's do some meditation.
Let's look at the peer group that you're spending time with. Are they supporting you with their habits? There was a study that was an offshoot from the Framingham data, the Framingham Heart Study that was done in Massachusetts, that long longitudinal study. And the study's title was The Spread of Obesity Through Social Networks. And they weren't talking about Facebook and Instagram and that. They were talking about how we don't typically think of obesity as a contagious condition or a contagious makeup that somebody might have, but actually they found that when they looked at somebody in their life, if their best friend or there's somebody that was close to them that was a friend, even more so than their spouse, even more so than their parents or their siblings, if their close friend became obese, they were much more likely to become obese themselves. So this just goes back to the message that you're sharing, that when you step into this mindset of wanting to improve your life, feel better, and hopefully make the world a better place too, you start to look at every single aspect that's there and ask yourself, what is the nutrition that I need in that area of my life to feel whole, complete, and give back to the world? And in some cases, it's actual food nutrition. In some cases, it's healing your relationship. In some cases, there's so many people that are so alone today and don't have somebody that they would call a best friend, somebody that they can rely on, that can be their confidant. And every time I hear you speak, I'm just reminded of like how deeply connected all aspects of our life are. And we should feel happy about that, because even sometimes you have a week where you don't feel like you hit your fasting goals, or you didn't make as much progress in your dietary goals that are there, or you didn't get as good enough sleep. Okay, great. Don't beat yourself up. There's all these other areas. How about just calling a friend that you haven't talked to in a little while and making their day? How about doing something nice or kind for someone and feeling that joy that comes from giving back into the world, even if it's something really small? There's always something that you can do to take a step in the right direction of feeling better.
Oh, absolutely. So you see, now you're really talking about a holistic approach to this whole problem of chronic degenerative diseases, of which nutrition fasting is one part of it. But you just hit on so many important points about it's our whole lifestyle. The number of visitors that come see a patient after open heart surgery dictates how well that patient's going to recover. I mean, it's ridiculous. The complication rates are higher if that person has no visitors. But what's that got to do with complications?
Wow.
Versus if there's lots of visitors, I mean, these studies are all done. The number of visitors after open heart surgery to that patient dictates whether he's going to get home at day number 9 or whether he'll be discharged at day number 5. What's that got to do with it? So it gets really complicated. But it gets complicated. But then when you sit down and think about it, it makes sense. That you feel connected, your platelets are now pacified, your endothelium is working better, your blood pressure is better, your physiology is dictated by the chemicals you put in and the medicines and the food, which is your medicine, but also how you think. Your brain and your whole psyche can also affect your entire physiology. So it's not just fasting. I mean, you can't be unhappy and fast. I mean, I think that's very bad. And you mentioned something about the contagiousness of, this is definitely because behavior is contagious. That's why when you're trying to fast, you got to stay away from those enablers that enable you to break your fast and go back and fall off the bandwagon because your best buddy says, oh, come on, man, no, we're going to go for a drink and we're going to have some chips and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's one thing. And the other thing is bacterial flora. So, it's amazing that your bacterial flora can dictate a lot of your physiology too. And I'm just digging into all this now. And I'm sure you're aware that, you can do fecal transplants from an obese person to a thin person and vice versa. And you can actually change physiology. And this data is just coming out and it's fascinating. But again, I tell my patients, look, that may be true. Just take care of your own flora. Feed them the right things. Give your gut a break. Let the bacteria flourish, the good ones, because the bad bugs have a short half-life. That means if you don't eat for 6 or 8 hours, you've knocked off some of the bad bacteria in your gut. So the good ones are the ones that are going to stay behind, and they're going to be your resident population. So I said, feed them the right thing. Eat according to our program over here, and you'll have the right bacteria. Then you won't have to talk about fecal transplants and capsules and all these things that they talk about these days. It's absolutely fascinating stuff.
It's so true. And also, too, when you get a craving, you have to think, we don't have the ability to distinguish it now, but is that you, or is that the quote unquote wrong bacteria that's having that craving? The yeast inside of the body, the candida, the buildup of different funguses, other things like that are in the gut that are craving because they feed off of these sugars, and those signaling molecules, those modulation of the gut bacteria can drive your own craving that's there. So sometimes it's not even you that's craving it. Sometimes it's your bacteria, and maybe not the type of bacteria that we want to continue to grow further.
Oh, you are so astute. You hit on that gut-brain axis connection. And it's so true. And I just want to leave you with one word about that. That is that almost 50 or 60% of the micronutrients that are floating around in my bloodstream and your bloodstream are not what we ate. It's what the bacteria made and liberated them as a gift to you because you harbored them and you fed them the right stuff, hopefully, and the right kinds are there, and they now float in your body. So if you look at turmeric, which our ancestry uses, and we say, oh, it's an antioxidant and all that. Well, actually, it works in different ways. And similarly, there are many others that actually the bacteria, the polyphenols are taken up by the bacteria, and they utilize those and then release the final chemicals into your body. It's not the polyphenols getting into your bloodstream. So you're eating for yourself, and you got to do the fasting, all this stuff, but you're also eating for your bacteria. And your bacteria in turn are producing tons and tons of chemicals that are then liberated into your bloodstream. So you just hit onto a huge thing right there. And, we can talk about hours and hours about all this wonderful new stuff we're learning. It's just amazing. Amazing.
Yeah, it's so amazing. I have a couple more questions that I want you to just be able to share about your world a little bit, and just anything that you want to have. If you had to ask for our audience, to check out something that you're up to, then I'd love to get to that. So selfish question that I'd love to ask you, I wear a continuous glucose monitor, and that's been amazing. I was one of those people that I was always more on the thin side, but I even noticed that even in my college career, growing up vegetarian, everything, I started even as thin as I was and quite skinny at the time. because I was vegan, I actually became vegan after that, after being vegetarian, I started to get a little bit of the belly. So I was that tofu. I was that, thin on the outside, fat on the inside, and I had that belly fat. Then I got into the world of functional medicine, other things, tried a bunch of different stuff, started incorporating back in super high quality animal foods into my diet, completely a game changer, especially I tested my omega-6 to omega-3 ratio using Omega Quant. It's a test that's out there that's pretty popular, no affiliation. And I saw that my omega-6 was really high and my omega-3 was really low. So I started incorporating high-quality fish into my diet, salmon, wild-caught salmon, other things, and I felt like a completely different person mentally. Like I was turned on. I wasn't clinically depressed before, but I was feeling like I wasn't as sharp and I didn't feel like that luster for life. So that evolved into, as keto became a little bit more popular, I said, you know what? Let me try this on. Now, I found through my experimentation of keto and I eating lower sugar, lower carbs in the diet that was there, that I fall into what looked like this smaller classification of people that has loosely been called like lean mass hyper responders. Those are people who their lipids, a lot of people go on a higher saturated fat diet and their lipids improve, like a lot of the patients you worked with. I went on that, even though I wasn't having the sugar and other things, and my markers, my LDL, my NMR profile breakdown of my small dense, they went in the wrong, like in the not the great direction. Have you worked at all with patients like that are in that category that might signal that, generally that type of diet works well for a lot of people and probably most people that are following the Western diet, but there could be either a phenotype or a genotype component where people don't do as well on that diet? Would love to hear any thoughts that you have.
So I think you hit on a number of good points over there. Number one is we are very variable in the way we respond to foods as well. So wearing the glucose monitor, you'll notice that somebody else eats that same meal. Their sugar response is different and yours is different. So, and different foods create a different rise in your glucose. So we are all a little bit different. So you need to find your food profile that best suits your glucose rise. So after experimenting with your diet to see which of your foods cause the greatest sugar rise in your bloodstream, you can't then take that and give it to everybody because they may react a little bit differently. So to a certain degree, what you've done is very unique because you've done a unique examination of your own sugars. So we all tend to respond a little bit differently. So I think that's a very important point. And then the other thing is that your lipids, for example, how they responded. Generally speaking, when I put my patients on a moderate fat, no sugar, moderate protein diet, the LDLs do go up, exactly like yours did. But what I find a little surprising with you is you said you had small dense particles. They go up, but they're usually large fluffy particles. So when your LDL particles become small, this is the take-home message. That means that no matter what you're doing, it may be helping you in other ways, but there may be some inflammation going on. Because when the LDL particle, how does it become small dense? It becomes small dense because lipopolysaccharides from your gut are actually getting in and they displace the cholesterol from the LDL particle and now create a small dense particle. That small dense particle also is more likely to get oxidized. So these small dense particles, you don't want them because they're more oxidized. So it tells you that you've got lipopolysaccharides, which is endotoxin, getting into your bloodstream. So then you've got to ask yourself, well, why is that happening? And it may be that there's certain foods that may not be causing symptoms in you, but may be causing a breach in your gut barrier. That may be because you got to ask yourself where this inflammation came from. And that's the $1,000,000 question I asked every professor when I was doing my fellowship. Where does this inflammation come from? Nobody had an answer. Not a single professor had an answer. And it's plagued me all my life. Where does this inflammation? It comes from the gut. It comes from the gut.
It's so interesting that you said that because we had a microbiologist on the podcast. His name is Kiran Krishnan, and he's with a company called Microbiome Labs. And he had suggested to me, because I had talked about this early on, that I said I had a relapse of some skin irritation and acne. And he said, you know what, for some people that had a history of leaky gut, And I had a lot of antibiotics usage when I was a kid for sore throat, other things, and I'd suffer from leaky gut. In some instances, higher saturated fats, even though they can be a lot of beneficial, like butter, ghee, coconut oil, they actually, if your leaky gut isn't fixed, they cause an endotoxemia effect. So I removed coconut oil from my diet. I removed the higher saturated fat foods, even though I love, grass-fed beef, and I think, I generally recommend it for people. And I noticed a cooling of the inflammation. My skin irritation went away, and it kind of brought down. And now I'm doing an updated gut protocol to heal all that. In the meantime, I've eased up on some of those foods personally, again, just for my own life, to cool that inflammation for me. But it just goes to show you that there's so many layers that are there. Generally speaking, everything that we talked about in this interview is largely going to work for people that are there, but we're all on our own unique journey of figuring things out.
Exactly. So we knew that you've got small dense particles, lipopolysaccharides. How do they get in? They get in through the leaky gut. What is the mechanism? What's the carrier molecule? The carrier molecule is saturated fat. So we do know that the more saturated fat you consume, and if you have a leaky gut, now those saturated fats will take endotoxin or lipopolysaccharides into your bloodstream and now cause small dense particles. So you got to work this out. So you're absolutely right. So working out this chemistry is very important. And everyone's individual. So say, okay, you did this, you did this, you did this. But now you got this. But what else can cause this? So you got to think this. Now, look, I'm a simple cardiologist. I'm not a gut doctor. No, am I? But
But you know more than most gut doctors that are out there. Just saying.
I just, it's fascinating to me. And it's very humbling that all this is going on, and we need lots more researchers and we need people like you to let people know that, look, it's complicated, but it can be done. Like how you worked it out. You said you still have a leaky gut. Okay, fine. And the saturated fats are the mechanism by which the lipopolysaccharides get in. So you got to look to see which foods may be causing your leaky gut and how can you get rid of that. So again, that gets really complicated, and people do tests in the bloodstream to see which antibodies are there and which foods might be causing it, because you may not have overt GI symptoms, but you may have certain food intolerances, especially wheat products. So what I do in my practice as a general rule, when I'm suspecting that there's this gut issue going on, I just have to stay away from wheat, because that's the number one problem I've found. And when I do that, honestly, for 80% of the patients, it helps my situation. They may not come back and say, oh, my bowels feel great, but I know that I've helped them because I see the markers in their bloodstream and other things, their weight and everything else I see. So wheat is a big one, especially processed wheat, and it's all processed. It's all made into powder. Wheat is number one. And then, of course, some people don't tolerate dairy products, but I do an elimination, a simple elimination. Look, right now, just get rid of all wheat. Just get rid of all wheat. And then if you're going to eat other substances, I do believe that you need to be careful about some lectins, because I tell them to soak the food, the lectin-containing foods, and then use a pressure cooker to kill them. So I teach them a little bit about how to eat right. And then I look and see what's happening. So, with a leaky gut, it gets a little complicated, but yeah, an elimination diet before I do blood tests, because otherwise there's so many blood tests.
What role can fasting play when it comes to optimizing our health and maybe even longevity?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because a lot of the research is still coming out. But, fasting does a lot of different things. And remember, when we're talking about fasting, it's really just any period of time that you're not eating. So there's no specific sort of, oh, you must do sort of like 40 days and 40 nights thing. There's no necessarily set limit. It all depends on the different type of person. However, there are several interesting things that happen as you get into sort of, 24 hours plus of fasting. And the thing that most people talk about most commonly, or the sort of most topical thing, is autophagy. And that's one of these things that has really, in the last, say, 5 years, has really broken through into the public consciousness, because in 2016, one of the big researchers in autophagy was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. So, of course, it brought a lot of publicity to it. A lot of people heard about it. And what it is autophagy is this process where, when you don't eat, your body starts to eat itself. That's what the word actually means. Auto meaning self, and phagein meaning eat. So you eat yourself. Sounds really bad. Sounds like, you're catabolizing, you're cannibalizing yourself. But that's actually very, very good, because what it does is, in a time where you don't have a lot of access to food, so such as fasting, your body is going to break down sort of the sort of low level stuff. So the proteins that are not working too well, they're really old, they're sort of junky, and it burns it off for energy. And it happens to these subcellular organelles. And basically, what you're trying to do is get rid of all the junk. So it's one of these mechanisms that's very hard to activate otherwise. And it's very important because a lot of the research was done on yeast. So this is actually a mechanism that has been conserved through evolution, basically through all sort of living things from yeast onwards. So very, very important to health, if you look at it from that standpoint. So what happens, of course, is that your body, like most people think breaking down is bad, but it's generally very good as you get older. So when you're young, you want to build things up, right? You're getting bigger, you're getting stronger, everything's growing in size. As you get to be an adult, it's not good to have a lot of growth. Extra growth is generally bad for you. So whether you're talking cancer, or whether you're talking, heart disease and stuff, which is, a lot of growth factors are actually going to make it worse. So one of the things that is really important to do is actually get rid of these sort of old junky parts. And then what happens, of course, during fasting is that as you sort of get rid of all that old junk, then your growth hormone is high. So as you eat again, your body is going to start rebuilding whatever is necessary. So you start with getting rid of stuff, then your body says, okay, so what do I actually need? And then it's going to rebuild it. So when you think about that whole process of getting rid of old stuff and then bringing back or rebuilding new stuff, it's the process of rejuvenation. So if you think about renovation, for example, you think that, oh, building is good, but you can't renovate that way. If you have an old, bathroom that you want to renovate, like the first thing you got to do is throw out all the old stuff. So you got to get rid of that avocado green tub and matching toilet kind of thing. You got to throw it out so you can put in a new tub and new floors and all that sort of stuff. But the first step is to get rid of the stuff. And that's why autophagy is so important, because without that, you can't actually rejuvenate yourself. If you don't get rid of the old stuff, you can't get new stuff in, right? It's like the spring cleaning for your body. Until you throw out all the stuff, you can't do anything. So that's why it's so important, this process of rejuvenation. So you're actually trying to make yourself sort of almost younger in that sense, because that's what that fasting does. And you might say, okay, well, what is the most important thing in terms of turning off and on autophagy? And it's really protein. So when you eat protein, that process of autophagy, so amino acids, which is the sort of building blocks of proteins, that is really just going to turn off autophagy just like that. So if people are eating sort of, a little bit all the time, and they're eating protein bars and all that time, you're really never getting into that stage of autophagy. And that's one of the things that people have talked about recently. Of course, the other things is that as you fast, what you're doing is you're tamping down, and this is another area of um, sort of very important sort of breakthroughs in the last 5-10 years, is that we have in our bodies certain nutrient sensors. That is, we sense what food energy is available. So we have insulin if you take carbohydrates, you have mTOR, which is senses if you take proteins, that kind of thing. So we have nutrient sensors. It turns out that these nutrient sensors are also growth factors. So when you're eating, you are turning up growth signaling. So anytime you eat, it's just built into our system. So if you look back, for instance, insulin, if you look back, insulin didn't start off as a nutrient sensor the way we think of it now, right? You eat, bread, insulin goes up. It's a nutrient sensor. It didn't start out that way. It started out as a growth factor. So what we've learned recently is that both the growth factors and the nutrient sensors in the human body, insulin, mTOR, are exactly the same molecule. So anytime you're eating, anytime you're taking nutrition, you're actually ramping up growth. And again, growth in most cases for adults is not a good thing. You don't want things to keep growing. That's how things break down. You actually got to get rid of stuff and then grow stuff. So a lot of these things like cancer, which is a disease of growth, are not going to be improved by insulin, say example, because that's going to increase growth, and cancer loves insulin, so it ramps up very quickly. So the thing is that when you do fasting, of course, you're going to reduce those nutrient sensors, which is going to intrinsically reduce growth and potentially reduce your risk of cancer, because we know that there's a number of cancers that are highly insulin sensitive, breast cancer, colorectal cancer, for example. So those are two examples of how fasting, sort of through autophagy and through reduced growth signaling, are going to be super, super important for longevity and, preventing disease, preventing cancers, that kind of thing.
You've shared before in other interviews that to really understand the importance of all this, we have to also understand and ask the most basic of basic questions, which is, why do we age? And you talked about how growth is not great as we get older, but for a long time, and maybe still a little bit right now, there's people that are not really clear about why is it that we age and what are the common things that contribute to that. And if we don't understand why we age, it's hard to understand how we can encourage longevity. So can you just take us through maybe a quick little history lesson of just what were some of the theories that were out there of aging, and what do some of the more contemporary ideas say around aging, and why are they so important?
Yeah, and it's still sort of not well known. I mean, there's a lot of theories of aging, like it's built in so that you get this constant replenishment of genes and so on. Initially, they thought, well, it's just sort of like a machine, right? It gets old and then it breaks down, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's not quite true, because our cells actually don't break down. We don't have the same cells. They sort of, our cells grow, they die, like red blood cells, right? Every 30 days, you sort of replace your blood cells. So they're not the same cells. So it's not like a machine. It's not like a stapler. You use it and you use it and you use it. Eventually it just breaks down and there's nothing you can do. That's not like our cells. Our cells actually rejuvenate. So then within our cells, we actually have this sort of built-in senescence mechanism, which is that after a certain number of replications, the cells can no longer divide, and therefore they start to get the problem with aging. And this is controlled with the telomeres, for example. So in the genes, you have in the DNA, you actually have these in the chromosomes. So DNA is packaged within a chromosome. At the ends of the chromosomes, you have these telomere caps, and sort of like an eraser on top of a pencil sort of thing. It just sits on top. And every time you replicate the cell, it sort of shrinks, and then once it gets down to nothing, the cell can no longer replicate, and basically it's senescent, or it can no longer do anything. Then it gets replaced with, say, scar tissue and so on. So you get less functional tissue and you get more scar tissue. But that's sort of this built-in senescent mechanism. Cancer actually circumvents that by getting rid of that, problem of the telomere cap. It doesn't reduce each time, and that's one of the reasons that cancer can actually replicate indefinitely. And that's one of the interesting things you see with unicellular organisms as well, as we talked about with the cancer code. But the so aging seems to be this sort of built-in sort of clock, but it doesn't necessarily have to, because again, one of the things that people now talk about is, one, you can't do anything about that telomere thing. It used to be very popular. You used to see it all the time, but telomere-based science and all this stuff. It was just a big marketing ploy. You can't do a lot about it unless you really want to give yourself cancer or something like that. But the whole idea is that with aging, it's not just about the sort of age, it's about the health as well. So people talk now about the health span. And in terms of aging, can you really slow it down by increasing this sort of rejuvenation of, this is not of the cell, but of those subcellular parts, as with autophagy and fasting. And also, to some extent, slowing down metabolic rate, which I actually think is kind of interesting as well, because one of the things that people always talk about, and this is a bit of a sidebar, but people always talk about how they want to keep their metabolic rate revved up. And I always think, okay, sure, it's easier to lose weight that way. I get you on that. But if you're not trying to lose weight, is it really beneficial to keep your metabolic rate revved up? Because it's like a car, right? You rev the engine, you can run faster, but you're going to burn out sooner. So it's like, are you really sacrificing one way or the other? So the way a lot of people look at it now is sort of this seesaw between growth and longevity. So, you can either grow really fast, but you're going to live a short time, or you're going to be on the other side of the seesaw, which is you're not going to grow and you're going to live long, right? So that's where people are looking at, trying to slow down growth, trying to say, okay, let's make sure that we're not stimulating these things that are going to increase growth factors, and those are all the nutrient sensors. So you look at some of the longest sort of lived people in the world, Okinawa and stuff, where they talk about, eating 80%, until you're about 80% full. And, people in Japan who also eat very little. So their metabolic rates are likely lower. Like if you ever go to Europe or Japan or some of these places, like they don't eat much. I mean, compared to an American meal, like you go to a restaurant and you go, whoa, I just paid a lot of money and that's all the food I get. So they don't eat a lot. So clearly they're used to it. So therefore, if they're not eating a lot, then since their weight is stable, their metabolic rates probably are not running as fast either. So therefore, they may be by eating smaller amounts by tradition, they may be choosing sort of to slow down growth and trying to go for that longevity as opposed to that growth, which is where Americans, North Americans, Canadians tend to be more, let's hit the growth, and then we don't hit that longevity as well. So if you're talking longevity, it's tied in very tightly to growth factors, growth signaling, that kind of thing.
Well, it seems, putting the two pieces of the questions together that you've answered so far, it seems like fasting has a very unique role, both when it comes to the health span aspect of improving your overall metabolic health, which is going to be one of the pathways to keep your metabolic rate down. Because if you are in better health, you're not struggling with processing food all day long, you're going to be able to keep your metabolic rate a little bit lower, which is going to improve your metabolic health, the way that I understand it. And then there's this other aspect where fasting also can play. It's not fully understood, but at least some evidence that's there. It can play a role with longevity. So it's both the health span and the lifespan. And is that a good way to think about it?
I think so. So, and fasting, interestingly enough, has always been sort of used as this way of staying healthy, right? You look back at all these traditions that we have, and, so like religious fasting, for example. So, in most religions, they have a period of fasting. And of course, at the time that these religions were established, there's not a lot of obesity. In fact, starvation is the predominant, is much more common than obesity back, say, 2, 3, 4,000 years ago, whenever these religions, and there's tons of them, right, that do the fasting. So it's interesting because when they talk about the fasting, it's a form of like they're not trying to punish themselves, right? It's not that they're trying to do something bad. They're usually trying to do something healthy for the body. So whether you're talking Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity or, you know, whatever it is, sometimes it's couched in terms of sort of self-denial, but a lot of times it's just something it's supposed to be sort of intrinsically healthy for you. And it's interesting because this is outside of weight loss. So for North Americans, particularly, the weight loss thing is a huge impact. Like that's a huge health benefit right there from fasting. So, but in terms of longevity, it may be that also it's going to have like this massive improvement in longevity by doing something. And it's sort of always been recognized that it is something that's healthy for you, whether they talk about a detox or whether you talk about a purification or, you know, a cleansing or something. It's always termed in the same way that it's something that you're sort of clearing out the old junk sort of thing. And interestingly enough, that's exactly what autophagy is. So in the last sort of 10 years, we've actually recognized the science behind all of this old sort of terminology of cleansing and detoxification, that, hey, maybe it's actually true. Maybe we've only just sort of put the scientific term on what all these other people who, you know, they didn't know the science, but they knew the benefits of what they were doing, and then codified it within these religious practices that various people follow. So it's an interesting way to look at it. So not only, as you said, with the health, you know, in terms of weight loss and all that stuff, that's immediately you know, obvious, but there may be that sort of hidden thing that takes a little longer for people to understand. Yeah, hey, this is something that's really highly beneficial for us.
Let's talk about caloric restriction and the importance of, first of all, for people that don't know what it is, just explaining, and how it fits in to the conversation that we're having here.
Yeah, so caloric restriction is probably the only really well-established scientific way of increasing longevity. And it's mostly animal studies. So they do this in animal studies. They take rats or something, and they have one that eats whatever they want and one group where they restrict how much they eat. And the group that restricts how much they eat generally live longer. So fruit flies, and you know, they've done it in all kinds of animals. So that this has been shown for ages. And that was sort of this really interesting, and the first studies that came out with, you know, came, you know, like, you know, 30-40 years ago, as a real shock to people, because people thought, well, hey, if you're more nourished, right, more nutrients, more vitamins, you're going to live longer. But they didn't. They all live shorter. And that was quite a shock. And this is that whole, that's what sort of is that whole seesaw between growth and longevity sort of thing. So caloric restriction is well established in most animal models as a way to increase longevity. In humans, of course, it's really hard to do those studies. There was a few inadvertent sort of ways to do it. But the problem is that you have to go between malnourishment. You don't want to get malnourished. So there's this, you know, continuum between calorie restriction, which is okay, and malnourishment, where you're just not getting enough vitamins and minerals and stuff, and then you actually do very badly. So sometimes they've crossed over. There was a couple of biosphere experiments where they sort of crossed that line. I think, you know, remember those old experiments where people would live in this contained dome and stuff. And it was a little controversial at the time, but they wound up sort of fairly severely calorie restricting themselves. And it wasn't always pretty. It wasn't great. So that was sort of an inadvertent human experiment into it. A fascinating sort of study for like sort of thing to look at sort of 20 years ago. But the whole idea is that if you are well nourished, as most people in, you know, North America say are, then the calorie restriction may actually improve your lifespan and health span by a fairly significant amount. So caloric restriction, and the question then is, how do you do it? And this is one of the big questions. So you can do it like the Okinawans do it, where you say, I am going to sort of eat to 80%. And so you impose that sort of structure so that you can do it. If you don't impose any kind of structure and you think day to day, oh, I'm just going to stop eating, like, a little bit. If you have to keep thinking about it, it's never going to work. Fasting is another way, of course, to impose that sort of caloric restriction by giving you the structure. So if you say, I'm not going to eat today, then you're almost automatically going to, calorie restrict yourself. There's some interesting studies on fasting where they try to get around that, because people always try to say, well, is it the fasting or is it the calories? It's like, I don't really care. Like, if you do fasting properly, then you are going to be calorie restricted, right? But so what? If I tell people, okay, cut 500 calories a day, and it just doesn't work to lose weight, then it doesn't matter. It's just a failed strategy. So why do I care that if I can do it through fasting, that I reduce 500 calories a day by saying, I'm just going to eat once a day, and that's going to do a 500 calorie a day restriction. If it's successful, it's successful. Like, it doesn't matter whether or not you restrict calories, how you restrict calories. If it works, it works, right? So don't worry about it so much. So there's some interesting studies lately that have tried to look at fasting. What they do is they try to get around that whole calorie part by saying, okay, you'll fast, but then you'll eat more when you're eating. I'm like, but that's not really the point of it, right? The whole point of the fasting is that when you're not eating, you're going to activate these mechanisms. You're going to get rid of some of this old stuff. You don't need to eat more because you're using up your body fat and all that sort of stuff. So the calorie restriction part of things is certainly part of the fasting. So therefore, I think you just have to take it all together, and rather than try to sort of tease it out and say, well, is it the calories? Is it the fasting? It's all part of the same thing. So it's just not that easy. If you eat once a day, or if you eat once every 2 days, it's not easy to pack all those 3 meals into a single one.
Yeah, I think what's important about what you're saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I definitely get things wrong sometimes, is that, we call it caloric restriction, and it is the most studied model for increasing longevity, specifically in animal trials. But we don't want to get too caught up in the idea of the calorie component. It's really just taking a break from your body doing that work so it can enter into the repair mode. And when you understand that, you can take advantage of it, because even the idea, and we've talked about it a bunch of this podcast, that the primary recommendations and guidance from whether it's the FDA or the World Health Organization, that weight loss is primarily a math equation. And if you want to lose weight, it's just about eating less and exercising more, is really not, the full picture, and might actually be very misguided in its approach, because there's so many other aspects that go into weight gain, like insulin, the mechanism of insulin and how that plays into it. So it's important to understand calorie restriction and caloric restriction as a concept, but really we're talking about taking advantage of your body going into the right environment so it can go into repair mode.
Exactly, and that's the whole idea of this seesaw, right? You're either going sort of in growth mode, or you're going into sort of repair mode, right? And that's one of the things that it's been a real shift in the last sort of number of years, because of course this whole idea of rejuvenation, repair, and stuff was probably only about 5 or 10 years. Like, before that, everybody was like growth. So it's like, if that's what you want to do, then it's eat, which is, of course, then you wound up with this whole obesity epidemic, then this kind of thing. But you're absolutely right. I mean, this whole calories debate is, to my mind, always a little bit silly. So the whole thing about calories is that it's not a concept from physiology. It's a concept from physics. So it's a unit of heat energy. That's purely what it is. right? But it doesn't tell you anything about what your body does with that energy. So, for example, if you eat a block of wood, it has a number of calories because if you burn it, it has a lot of calories because it's energy. That's energy. But your body cannot do anything with it, right? So you eat a block of wood, it comes out your rectum, and that's it. That's all. There's no energy associated with it, even though within that wood there is a lot of potential energy. So it's the same thing, right? The calories, your body doesn't say, oh, you have this X number of calories, so I'm going to do this. No, your body has to translate that into something else. And that's that piece that's missing, right? It translates it into hormones, which is why you always have to look at the hormones because that's sort of the language of the body. That's physiology, right? You can't take a unit of energy like physics and say, well, all calories are the same because calories do different things. So that block of wood does nothing for you. If you eat a cookie, it's going to trigger off hormones that are incredibly different than if you were to eat, say, an egg, for example, right? So you eat protein and fat. The hormonal profile that you get is completely different than if you eat a cookie, which is completely different than if you eat a block of wood. Yet the calories are all equal. So how is that the same? Because those hormones are what tells our body what to do. Go into growth mode, go into repair mode, or don't do anything at all, right? With a piece of wood. So that whole thing about calories is, I say it just because that's what people are used to. It's easy for people to understand what's going on. But truthfully, the whole concept is quite useless to understand what's going on with the body. Like you take, 100 calories of cookies and 100 calories of an egg, for example, right? The minute those foods go into your mouth, the hormonal response is totally different. Therefore, our bodies are going to be doing something completely different with those two foods, even though they're the same calories, right? If your insulin goes up, your body says, store that calories as fat. If it doesn't go up, your body will say, take those calories and use them, burn it for energy, right? So it's totally different. And, I think that's where people get so messed up is because we're so ingrained in this idea of calories, that calories are equal, because when you put them as the same thing, right? 100 calories of cookies, 100 calories of broccoli. Well, now they're both 100 calories, so you can treat them the same. You cannot treat them the same. There's no physiologic way like that they are the same in any degree. Like, yes, there's an overlap. Sure, there's more overlap between that and 100 calories of wood, but those calories is nothing. It's just energy, right? What our body does with that energy is what's important. Do you store it as fat? Do you build new proteins, right? Do you just increase the metabolic rate and burn it as heat, for example? It's all different, right? In one case, you're going to get stronger, right? In one case, you're going to get fatter. And in one case, your metabolic rate's going to go up. Completely different from the same 100 calories.
It's such an important point. And this idea, which was really a theory, the calorie in, calorie out model of obesity and sort of why we gain weight, it's so indoctrinated into society that a lot of individuals, including well-established experts and doctors, took it as just settled science. And recently, there was a big paper that was done, a review paper in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition by Dr. David Ludwig at Harvard, including a bunch of other doctors that were there too. And really, they took you through the whole journey of how we got there, how it was shaky science that sort of led to that understanding. And you've talked about this as well too, just highlighting it because that paper was published recently. We'll have the link in the show notes. And then all the way to the idea of understanding exactly what you shared about how hormones is the missing piece of the puzzle. When I read that and I hear your example, I often think about, NASA has the largest vacuum that they use to test devices that they're going to put in space. It's the largest vacuum in the world. And it's, I think it might be in Georgia, but I'll have to double check that. And if you take a bowling ball and you take a feather and you drop it in a vacuum, they both fall at the same rate. But in the real world, if you're in a Boeing 747 and you drop a bowling ball and a feather at the same time, they're not going to fall at the same rate. And our body is like that. It's a bunch of moving parts and pieces. It's not just physics that are in isolation. That's what I'm hearing from your message.
Well, exactly, and there's I think the whole calories thing is sort of physics envy sort of thing, right? We want to be as clean and as precise as physics is, right? Because you look at physics, wow, they're building spaceships and computers and all this stuff, and it's like this is great, right? So physics is all very precise, it's all very math based, and when physiology wants to be sort of has all this physics envy, they're like, we want to be precise, just like physics. But then you ignore the whole messiness that is human physiology because, does insulin go up? Take those 100 calories, right? Does insulin go up? Does it not go up? Does peptide YY, which is a satiety hormone, go up? Does it not go up? Do the stretch receptors in your stomach go up or down if you eat a big fibrous meal, like a big, if you eat a lot of, say vegetables and your stomach stretches out? Well, it doesn't have any calories because you could eat hair and your stomach will stretch and turn on your satiety signals, right? So there's stretch receptors in the stomach. Do those 100 calories, do they increase cholecystokinin, which is in response to fat, for example? What does it do to leptin? Like it's messy like crazy, but that's reality, right? And all it means is that because every food is going to have a different hormonal profile, all it says is that certain foods for the same number of calories are more fattening than others, which is actually just common sense, right? I don't think anybody would really doubt that cookies and ice cream is more fattening than salmon and salad. It's it's hard to get fat eating salad. It just is, right? So that's very common sense. It's totally in line with what the physiology is, that hey, all these foods have different hormonal profiles. Some are going to lead to more body increasing fat stores, right? And others are not. So therefore, some foods are more fattening than others. That's all it says, right? I don't see how that's so non-scientific. Because some people say, oh, you're a calorie denier or something like that. I'm like, I'm just telling you that calories is not a concept of physiology. It's a concept of physics. And it's this whole idea that they are equal, and this whole idea of, creating a caloric deficit. I mean, that's another really stupid idea, I have to say. So this idea of, to lose weight, you have to create a caloric deficit. Now, that's always true. The question is, how do you create the caloric deficit? Remember, when you take that energy balance equation, you have body fat, which is a storage form of energy, right? It's a storage form of calories. It's stored calories. That's basically what it is. Body fat equals calories in, calories out. So when you look at that, it's inequality, right? X equals A plus B or whatever, right? So body fat equals calories in minus calories out. That's always true. The question is, so it's not two things. You have three variables there. And those always have to balance. So you can never have a deficit. You either have storage, you have calories in, you have calories out. So the question is, how do you create that inequality? If you want to lose body fat, you want to have calories in minus calories out. So that's true. So, but then they take that next step and they say, therefore, all you have to do is reduce your calories in. Well, two things can happen when you reduce those calories in. Either, right, so you have three things. You have storage, you have calories in, you have calories out. So you reduce calories in. Two possible things can happen. Either body fat goes down, which is what they tell you is going to happen, or, which is perfectly in line with math, right? Either when calories in goes down, either body fat goes down or calories out goes down. Both are possibilities because there's three variables here. What they don't tell you, which is what the science of the last 100 years has told you, is that every time you reduce calories in just by focusing on calories and not focusing on the hormones, what happens is not that the body fat goes down, but that the calories out or your metabolic rate goes down. So we know this from, I don't know, there's hundreds of years of research of this. The first research looking at this was from 1917. So more than 100 years ago, they showed this exact thing. Reduce calories in, reduce calories out. Your calories out goes down. So you take 2,000 calories in, drops down to 1,500, right? So two things can happen. Either your body loses 500 calories of body fat, or your metabolic rate goes down by 500. Guess which one almost always happens? Is that the calories out goes down. That's just science. We know that. We've been proven that over and over again. So therefore, the question is not about whether or not a caloric deficit reduces body fat. Yes, it does. The question is, how do you create that caloric deficit? You cannot do that by reducing calories in. You similarly cannot reduce it by trying to increase calories out by exercising, which is the other thing that people always talk about. Because yes, when you exercise, you are going to increase the rate of energy that your skeletal muscles will use. But there's all these other parts of our body that exercise does nothing for. So there's your bladder, there's your kidneys. Like, does exercising increase the metabolic rate of your kidneys? Not in the least. Your liver, your heart, your lungs, your brain. Like, there's all these other organ systems that use energy all the time. The skeletal muscle is only a single system, right? So yeah, if you exercise for 6 hours a day, you can sort of overwhelm that effect. But remember, most of us are, say, burning 2,000 calories a day. You go for a run or something, you might burn what? You've seen those treadmills. That calorie counter goes up really, really slowly, right? So if you have somebody, okay, so you burn 200 calories, 300 calories, like, you're not even at 10% of what your body does using your kidneys, your liver, your body heat generation, all that kind of thing. So this idea that you're going to exercise your way out of it is also similarly false. And the other thing is that, remember, there's three variables. You increase your calories out by exercising, two things can happen. One is that you're going to take that energy from your body fat stores. That's what they want to happen. That's what almost never happens. What happens is that you eat more, right? And that's perfectly in balance with this energy balance equation. Three variables. They always only look at two of them, right? As if one of them is fixed, as if your calories out are fixed. And that's the whole thing that these people never seem to understand. I don't know why. It's very obvious when you just, put it out. There's three legs on this stool, right? You change one of the other two can change. It's not for sure that, they say body fat equals calories in minus calories out, reduce calories in, calories out. If it stays stable, then you'll lower your body fat, but it doesn't stay stable.
Where do you see intermittent fasting as being overrated in people's journey, but more importantly, underrated, that could be a powerful tool to help people transform their bodies and their lives?
Yeah, I'll start with the underrated piece. I think that it's vastly, vastly underrated, the fact that intermittent fasting gives people an element of mastery with the control in their diet. And I think that we live in a world where we don't have a lot of control. We might feel like we have a lot of control over what we eat, but let's be really real here. We have tons of hyperpalatable foods that are lighting our brains up like Christmas trees all the time. That's not control. Like, the food controls us. And we may not want to admit it. It may sound kind of weird and almost woo-woo witch doctor-y to say that, but it kind of does. We have, I'm not even trying to sound crazy conspiracy here, but we've got food marketers that know what they're doing. Food tastes dang good. It lights our brains up and it makes us want more. With fasting, the underrated component of it is just that simple element of mastery and being able to abstain. Like, abstinence from food is a powerful thing. Like, we're exposed to food all the time. The ability to be able to just say no and have complete control is freaking powerful as all. And that is the piece that is underrated, because everyone wants to focus on these overrated, nuanced pieces that are still important. But, we talk about things like autophagy, which is great. Fasting absolutely induces autophagy, but exercise also induces autophagy. Fasting is a means of activating a lot of different cellular processes that would ordinarily be activated through other processes like exercise or caloric restriction. It just works better for some people because their minds work that way. For example, I could have easily just restricted calories when I lost 110 pounds. No denying that could have worked. But did it mentally work for me? No, it didn't. I tried and I felt like a slave to food. I felt like a slave to the scale. I felt like a slave to tracking. It ruined my life. It was terrible. Whereas fasting gave me peace and gave me like a lot of flexibility. And it was still putting me in that same box. Was I accomplishing the same things that I would have accomplished with caloric restriction? Yeah, but arguably faster, arguably in a more defined way, arguably in a way that jived with my personality better. And so it's not to say that things like intermittent fasting don't induce these amazing things like autophagy. But what I'm trying to say is that to say that fasting is the only way that does that is also factually incorrect. It's just one of many ways to get there. And that's just one that I talk about a lot because I'm guilty of talking about autophagy and sort of embellishing how cool it is because it's to drive home a point of how cool this cellular process is. But a lot of people that try intermittent fasting are also people that are very overweight or metabolically dysfunctional and don't have the ability to really exercise with any intensity just yet.
You know, you mentioned a key word there, which was flexibility. And I've heard you say in previous interviews that the level of flexibility that you feel because you have intermittent fasting as a tool in your toolbox, like that's the number one benefit to you. What's an example of that flexibility that shows up on a daily or weekly basis that allows for more freedom in your life?
Maybe I want to have a chicken nugget with my kids, you know, not from, you know, McDonald's or anything, but maybe like, you know, gluten-free chicken nugget or something, right? Like maybe I want to be able to have some flexibility. Maybe I want to go have some ice cream with my kids now and then, let them be kids and not have dad be a robot, right? Maybe I want them to experience food in a way where they can establish control and establish their own boundaries. And if I am constantly having my guard up and not touching these foods, I'm risking giving my kids eating disorders, right? So I need to make sure that they can experience foods themselves and see dad experience these foods, but also see dad put up the guardrails when he needs to put up the guardrails and get his life on track. But also being able to just enjoy food. I'm a foodie, like I am. I always have been. I mean, hence I was 300 pounds before. I clearly like food. There's no denying that. So being able to enjoy food, but being able to have a strong understanding of when it's time to stop, but have a very clear black and white picture of, okay, I'm eating now, I'm not eating now. And when I first went through my weight loss journey, like the first couple of months when I lost like 50 pounds in the first 3.5 months or so, that was all being very flexible. That was just with intermittent fasting, still eating the foods that I liked, but just putting them into a compressed eating window. So yeah, I was probably restricting calories, but dude, I was still able to eat pizza. I was still able to eat burgers. I was still able to eat the foods that I wanted to. I just was eating a significantly less amount of them.
I'd love to pivot to overrated, but also based off of your life experiences. After having done intermittent fasting and it being a part of your life now, and we'll talk about how you go about it now compared to previously, what have you found that you modified it, or maybe you changed your mind or your recommendations on your YouTube page? A lot of people watch your videos that like your thinking evolved over a period of time based on some of the more overrated factors of intermittent fasting.
Yeah. I mean, for one, just diving more into research too, and seeing more and more and more and understanding the nuance. But what really started to get me to say, okay, I need to take a look at this is how things started to change after I lost weight. Because intermittent fasting works super, super, super well when you are at a metabolic disadvantage, when you are metabolically unhealthy, when you have mitochondrial dysfunction, when your energy systems aren't working well, when you're overweight, when you have metabolic syndrome, syndrome X. Like there's no denying that, and the research is very clear. But once I got to a point where, okay, well, now I'm maintaining weight, things are different. If I fast too much, it's actually not good for me. I'm trying to just maintain now. I don't have any more to really lose. I'm trying to just stay lean. So I need to pivot my way of thinking while also making sure that when I'm talking to my audience, I'm understanding that I have, you know, a split demographic of people that are already lean and people that are just coming to my channel that are like, man, I'm looking for help. So I have to make sure that I navigate that very, very carefully to not discourage people. And a perfect example is I used to fast every day. You know, I used to fast every day because I thought that that was the way to do it because it just made sense. I was skipping breakfast. It worked. It got the weight off of me. But if I did that now at my current body weight, I think that it would probably be problematic. So like I've adjusted my fasting to be more 3 days a week per se, and maybe increase the length of my fast so it's more of a, you know, a shock. Also just seeing as intermittent fasting grew in popularity again over the last, like, I don't know, 6 years ago when it really started the hockey stick up again, of course, you've got social media. So you've got influencers that hop on the bandwagon and they start talking about it, but they're maybe embellishing things that maybe shouldn't be embellished. And it was starting to give the intermittent fasting crowd a bad name. And that was frustrating for me because I'm someone that, like, I literally owe my life to intermittent fasting. I don't know if I would be here today if it wasn't for it because I was so unhealthy. So that was frustrating to me to see, like, guys, I know you're excited about intermittent fasting, but you got to check yourself a little bit with some of the claims you're making, because it's those claims that are triggering so many people to come and attack intermittent fasting that have really big audiences. And now you're going to completely squelch the benefits of it because people are going to listen to the people that are squelching intermittent fasting versus the people that are really getting benefit from it. So I'm like, you know what? I need to be the guy that actually splits the lane here. I need to be the guy that helps people understand that, like, yes, you know what? It's okay to get on your high horse about fasting. It's okay, but you gotta be real. We can't just say it's magic all the time, even though it feels like it is. It felt like magic to me, and I'm guilty of probably shouting from the rooftops like it was magic because, dude, I mean, this was the only thing that worked for me. So, I mean, I get that, but it was at that point where I'm like, I need to start putting some bumpers up on how I talk about it.
You made a really great video recently talking about how do you know if fasting is working? Like, what should you be measuring?
Mm-hmm.
What should you be looking at? And for the person that's listening today, where they have a significant amount of weight that they want to make a shift on, they want to improve their body composition, right? Because you talked about the different camps. For simplicity purposes, let's say that's one camp. And then we'll get to the other camp, which is people who already have some sense of being lean and, they may not want to lose muscle mass and other areas. We'll talk about them in a second. So for the person who has a significant amount of weight that they want to shift, they want to improve their body composition, what are some of the things they should be looking at, maybe taking inspiration from that video that you made, to know if intermittent fasting is actually working for them and they're making progress?
Yeah. I mean, the obvious one is, people are first going to think about their weight, right? Is weight working? Is weight dropping? Is things like that? Yeah. And that's a very valid thing to look at, of course. But there's a lot of other components there. Just because someone's losing weight doesn't mean you're losing the right kind of weight. So for one, it also doesn't mean that you're healthy. It could just mean that you're losing muscle mass and you're not losing fat, right? So I try to look at a lot of things. So looking at, even your fasting glucose is a tremendous way to just understand, is this working? Because there are lots of bodies of research that still put people in a stage of caloric restriction where their glucose is still really cattywampus and still out of whack. So if you're trying to say, hey, I'm just trying to get my metabolic health in check, is fasting working for me? I mean, being able to draw a line in the sand of where your blood glucose is when you start fasting versus where it is now, in terms of the long haul, not on the daily. Is your HbA1c improving? Are you noticing improvements in your just metabolic biomarkers? If you have the ability to go get a DEXA scan, I mean, being able to look at your visceral fat, that's a big, big piece of intermittent fasting, is the reduction in visceral fat, which I think all camps can agree that is one of the most dangerous things that we could have, is high levels of visceral fat, as far as inflammation is concerned, as far as a number of different factors. Fatty liver, sort of a proxy for fatty liver. So with that, it's like, okay, if you have the ability to get a DEXA scan and you can see, hey, my visceral fat is actually shrinking, that is a great barometer for how well fasting is working. Also, in the moment, being able to test your ketones. I mean, are you actually getting the metabolic benefit that you want during a fast? So you can get pretty granular with that. But I think also looking at C-reactive protein, like looking at your inflammatory markers, arguably losing weight in general, caloric restriction, you're going to see an improvement in those kind of biomarkers, your IL-6. Your C-reactive protein is the main one that, like, if you went to your doctor and said, I want to test for inflammation, they'd test your CRP, and it's a pretty simple panel. It's not like anything crazy that you'd have to pay a ton of money for. That's a very important number to look at, because if your CRP is improving, that's indicative of, lowering inflammation regardless of weight loss. So even if your weight was the same, but your CRP is improving, that's tremendous. And that is a very early sign that your body is moving in the right direction. Also, your heart rate variability. If anyone wears a Whoop or an Oura, or even the Apple Watch can do it now, and Fitbit can look at that now. So it's pretty easy and mainstream. Looking at your heart rate variability, that tells you sort of if you're fasting too much, right? So if you start finding that like I'm fasting a lot, I feel good, but your HRV is going down, indicating your recovery is going down, well, that's a good time to note that, hey, maybe I should stop fasting for a little bit and kind of check myself a little bit so that the HRV comes back up. Because you don't want to put the cart before the horse, fast for all these metabolic benefits while in the meantime driving yourself into the ground.
You know, what I loved about that video is that, you know, you've kind of contrasted that, you know, there's a lot of different ways to fast, and the type of fast that we want to avoid is kind of like the standard American way of fasting, right? Yep. And it's, from what I understand, what you meant by that is this idea that people are going to fast, but when they're going to eat again, they're going to eat a diet that's constantly throwing their blood sugar on a roller coaster. They're fasting, insulin is high, and they're eating still a lot of processed foods. Now, some people have still gotten benefits from incorporating fasting, especially if it maybe helped them, as you mentioned, reduce calories. But in general, tell us why that standard American approach of fasting, where you don't eat, and maybe you don't eat a lot, so you're sort of putting on this extreme pressure on your body, and then when you do eat, you're eating all sorts of junk again. Yeah. Tell us why that's not ideal.
Yeah, I'll put it into sort of maybe a visual metaphor a little bit. Let's say you were in a really, really loud room, and that loud room was your standard American diet. It was just loud and noisy and like just bass booming all the time. You couldn't hear each other talk. You couldn't hear yourself think. And then you go and you fast, and you go into this like eerily quiet room where suddenly, you know, you could hear a mouse piss in a cotton ball. It's just like super quiet, right? And then you all of a sudden say, okay, I'm going to jump back into this room of the standard American diet noise. How loud would that noise seem? How disruptive would that seem, right? Now I want you to think, on the contrary, you step out of that loud room, go into the quiet room, and then you step into the one room and there's just a gentle trickle of a brook and a waterfall, and it's just kind of nice. And then you step into another room and maybe there's a little bit more noise. Then you step into another room and then it's a little louder. A much more peaceful experience, a much easier on the ears. It's much easier on the brain. It's much easier on your psyche. It's going to be less stressful. It's a simple analogy for how it is with fasting. It's like you're abstaining from food. Your body is resetting. Your body is getting to a stage where it's, for all intents and purposes, it's more sensitive. It's potentially cleaner. It's everything's operating a little bit better, right? And then all of a sudden, you're just going to throw the Pop-Tarts back in the mix. You may as well be just jumping into that, you know, Dolby surround, super loud room. It's going to be a shock to your body, and it's going to be highly inflammatory. And the nuance here, of course, anytime you eat anything, there's a level of inflammatory response. Like, make no mistake. Like if I ate a salad right now, there's going to be some inflammation. It's just a normal thing. So don't get the wrong idea that like, oh, like I'm going to have inflammation when I eat and it's bad. But arguably, the worse the food is, the higher the abundance of the food, especially in a short bout, the higher the inflammatory response is going to be. And you sort of counteract all these benefits you've been trying to get from fasting in the first place. So although it worked well for me in terms of flexibility, eating burgers and pizza and stuff like that for the first few months, I quickly learned that although I was losing weight, I felt like total dog crap. I did not feel good.
When you would go back to eating those same sort of processed foods that you were having before.
Yeah. So it's, you know, you're defeating the entire purpose, really. You know, you're taking all this work, putting all this work into being able to reset your body and kind of have a clean start, only to reintroduce things that you're only going to be more sensitive to in the first place. It's that whole white noise analogy. You know, it's like you turn the fan on, you can hear the noise, you turn it off, you know, it's quiet, and then you can, you know, it's like you get accustomed to it. So when you're constantly eating these processed foods all the time, that just seems like the normal thing. But once you pull that away for a while and then introduce it again, it's all the more intense.
What did you notice when you got started? Was your body naturally sort of shifting and wanting to incorporate more whole foods along with your fasting routine? Like, was it a gradual, natural process? Or did you feel like you had to sort of fight and battle this world of addiction that's kind of constantly around us that wants to get us sucked into these hyper palatable foods? Like, was this a conscious choice that you made, or did you gradually find that your body started craving different things once you started fasting?
It's a good question. And it's the latter. It's the junk food actually just didn't feel good anymore. Is like after the weight started coming off, I think my body was starting to be a little bit more fine-tuned, and was realizing like this was just happening out of habit. It wasn't feeling good. So naturally, I actually wanted more whole foods. And once I started implementing the whole foods, then everything felt, you know, so much better. So it's definitely when I was just restricting calories before I really tried intermittent fasting, it was much more difficult for me to eat healthy foods because I was constantly faced with them. I was constantly having to make decisions. I was constantly having to prefrontal cortex my way through things, right? So it's like if I was eating 5 meals per day, that was 5 different opportunities in the course of a day that I would have to use my willpower. Whereas with fasting, it was like 2 opportunities, 2 chances to F up, right? So it just really made a big difference just by sheer statistical looks at it. Like if you give me 5 opportunities to screw up, I'm going to have a much higher likelihood of screwing up. If you give me 2 opportunities to screw up, I probably won't screw up.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I feel like you do this well with your videos. This is something that I feel that the traditional world of energy balance, and for those that are listening, it's like the traditional world of it's all about calories in and it's all about calories out. Not else matters, and it's just about energy balance, and that's how we're going to keep people healthy and keep weight off. And of course, there are some truths to that. We'll chat about that in a second, but that world, when they look at fasting, I feel like one of the biggest things they miss is that component that processed food, especially ultra processed food, is so hyper palatable that if you're trying to just restrict calories in itself, it's actually like it's like hijacked your brain and you feel like you have zero control. And that's probably what you're referring to when you felt like nothing was working when you were following the traditional advice. Is that right?
Yeah, totally, man. And I talk about this to this day, and it kind of frustrates me because I absolutely understand thermodynamics. I'm not an idiot. I can look at that. I understand the math. I understand the physics of it. Like I understand that energy balance is such an important piece, but I also feel like there's this big piece that's missing. Like clearly telling people to eat less and move more is not working. Like clearly, because obesity is only increasing. And that message has only gotten louder and louder and louder. And for some reason, that crowd wants to make it sound like it's the fasting groups and the low carb groups that are ruining everything because we're the ones confusing people. I don't think that's the case. I think that it's a problem with all of us. It's not just the low carb or the fasting community like making crazy claims that are causing people to not have success. It's also the evidence-based community that's causing the problems too. Because if you just tell someone to move more and eat less and listen to their body, like, I'm sorry, but we don't have control anymore. Like, we can't just listen to our bodies, especially when you have someone in the fitness industry telling you that. Someone in the fitness industry that has a lifetime of coping mechanisms to make sure that they live their life a certain way and look a certain way, whether that means that they have to log everything and track everything down to the T to become obsessive to look a certain way. It's easy coming out of the mouth of those people. But when you've been overweight before and you've seen other people struggle, it kind of pisses you off because you're like, no, I've tried that. And I'm not saying that reducing calories doesn't work, but I'm saying that if I simply just try to track everything, I am going to be at the mercy of every delicious thing that's on the grocery store shelf, and I'm not going to win. Because not everyone has the willpower that every person in the fitness industry does. Those people are outliers, and they should be talking to other outliers. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense.
Yeah.
When you decided that you were going to try fasting on and that it was going to be a potential solution for you to help significantly reduce your weight. I think at that time you had become 110 pounds overweight about, and a little bit of your story, which I found really fascinating, is that you were a skinny kid in high school, right? And then you decided later in high school, if I got correct, you wanted to bulk up. So you got into fitness and you started eating more. Your mom was really into like running, and you wanted to be like your mom, and you have got a close relationship. So you started getting very active. And along with that activity, your caloric intake went up to match the level of fuel that you needed to support that level of activity. And then life happening, stress factors, other stuff. I want to talk about stress because you talk so much about stress being the biggest factor that kind of shifted things in your journey. And now all of a sudden your consumption is really high and your activity level is changing and you have all this stress and now you're gaining weight. Is that an accurate understanding of the story?
That's perfect. Yep.
So then at a certain point in time, you are now carrying all this excess weight and you're feeling like, okay, I need to give something a shot. So how did intermittent fasting even first make it onto your radar as a possible solution to incorporate?
Yeah. I mean, the industry that I was in sort of a like biomedical, biotech sales really. So I worked with a lot of physicians. We had a lot of medical advisors in the company that I was with. And I was pretty good friends with them anyway, just because we were, associates in work. And they knew me when I was overweight, and they never really pushed any agenda on me. I mean, occasionally a comment would be made that like it was kind of ironic that, the world that we were in and I was here, I was overweight. But ultimately, when I finally did decide that it was time to lose weight, there were a couple of different instances where a couple of the docs that I knew were just kind of casual about, hey, like we've had good success with some of our patients that have been, doing this intermittent fasting thing, and it might work really well for you. So it was really just like a casual, like, hey, you should try this from some people that I trusted. And really, I never looked back. So it wasn't like I was scouring the internet looking for the right kind of thing. It was more so like I knew what I needed to do as far as eating less, but it was just very difficult for me in the environment that I was in. High stress commission only work where I was just like, if I didn't perform, I didn't get paid. That was just difficult for me to also try to keep track of how much I was eating, try to like exercise more, try to do all these different things. I just didn't have the time. I didn't have the resources. Like if I took more time to track my food or took more time to exercise, that would mean that I was lacking in the financial department, right? So it was really, really difficult for me. Now, in retrospect, knowing what I know now, I think I could have always made the time, right? Like maybe I just wasn't in the headspace, right? And everyone can make the time. If it's a priority to you, you make the time. But it was also a priority of mine to put food on the table for my wife and I. So fasting was like, dude, this is great. I actually like save time. Like I'm actually not eating. I'm not worrying about eating. So I didn't really have to exercise a whole lot in the first like month or so. And then I started kind of running again and, doing other things. But yeah, I mean, that's how it ended up on my radar.
And when you first decided to take it on, and I think a lot of people are in this position, was there enough clarity at the time where you were like, okay, here's how I'm going to approach intermittent fasting? Like, how did you decide which version of fasting to take on? And what did you start off with? And is that the version that you kept up in the process of, body composition change?
Yeah. Actually, the funny thing is like, I did like one simple fast where I like didn't eat breakfast and I was like, this is easy. And then like 3 days later, I just decided to not eat for 2 days. And I was just like, I'm just going to do a 2-day fast. And I don't remember how much weight I lost, but it was super successful and I felt great. And I was just like, oh, cool. This is awesome. But it was also hard. So I was like, I'm not going to do that again. But anyway, I just jumped right in. That's kind of my mentality and my personality anyway. I was just like, screw it. If this works, if it works for 16 hours, it's going to work better with 48. And it did, but it's not something that I would say I'm going to do like 2 48-hour fasts a week or something. So then I jumped into the conventional 16/8 and I did that for like a good 6 months or so before I really started kind of lengthening my fasts and playing around with different things.
So just for people who are following along, that means you're not eating for 16 hours.
Yes.
And then you have an 8-hour eating window.
Correct. Yeah.
And in that 8-hour eating window, what were you finding? Again, it changed over a period of time. You started off with this sort of standard American fasting where you were still going back and eating some of the processed foods that were there. But once you got into a good routine, what were the tips and tricks that you found to make that sustainable for you, specifically during the time that you were eating, so that the time that you weren't eating was a lot easier to end up? So one of them was obviously shifting towards whole foods. Yep. Was there anything else? Would you have your bigger meal in the morning or in the evening? Like, what were you doing that you found was helpful for you?
I didn't start manipulating timing a whole lot until I was a couple years in, until I really kind of started understanding things more. One of the things that, as some people like it, some people don't, but 6-7 months in after I was kind of starting to implement more whole foods is when I added keto into the mix too. And was a huge game changer for me because especially at the time, 11 years ago or so, there weren't super delicious keto treats everywhere. Right. So for me, I was doing keto before the keto wave came along. And that just by default meant that I was eating pretty wholesome foods. Like keto at that point, I was basically eating meat, cheese, coconut oil, and avocados. It was pretty hard to go off the rails with that. And once I did that, it was like, I'm never turning back. I was like, this is the way I want to live for the rest of my life. Obviously things have changed now that I'm, at my set weight and I don't necessarily feel like I need to do keto all the time. I feel like I can dance around with different things. But the point is like, I felt so dang amazing that there was like no cravings whatsoever. It was really, really crazy. But by and large, the ways that I controlled my eating period, I would typically break my fast with something really light. And I didn't always do that. but I realized that I was always getting bloated whenever I would break my fast and eat something big. I used to kind of like break my fast, and I used to either like have like a Chick-fil-A or, something, right? Or like it was like I was still eating crap when I was first starting, and that was a terrible disaster. And then a few months in, then I would just sort of like make my own food. Maybe I would make, pasta or whatever. I didn't really know what I was doing. And then as time went on and I started adding the whole foods in, I was realizing, well, wait a minute, if I have like a salad right when I break my fast, I feel kind of bloated. And then I was realizing like, okay, if I have fiber right when I break my fast, I feel bloated. Maybe I need to kind of figure out the system here. So I started figuring out that if I just had a little bit of lean protein, I would control my cravings. I would feel satiated right when I broke my fast. And it would give me this massive element of control over the rest of my eating period. Whereas if I had something high in starch and high in carbohydrates right when I broke my fast, I would feel like I would have to be battling these blood sugar roller coasters the rest of the eating period. And it was like a struggle. And I was actually looking forward to the next day of fasting because I didn't have to deal with the struggle anymore, because it was actually like, it was turmoil. It was like 8 hours of hell trying to like combat these cravings. Then I realized, if I just have like a 6 or 7 ounce chicken breast or even a protein shake right when I break my fast, I'm not craving crazy amounts of things. So then I can have a lot more control.
So the influence of sort of blood sugar and your knowledge around that played a huge role in how you actually felt and your ability to be compliant with fasting.
Yes. And I had a knowledge of blood sugar stuff because when I was overweight, I became clinically diabetic in a short period of time. So, I had sort of the standard operating procedure sort of thing that they would give you, and you get diagnosed with diabetes. I was 144 milligrams per deciliter. So I was definitely in the diabetic range. I made myself that pretty quick. So, I got the handbook, right? Like the little pamphlet the doctors give you and they say you're diabetic, not needing insulin yet, but needing to like kind of eat the special diet that they said, which was total baloney, by the way. It was just like,
what were they telling you to eat?
Brown rice instead of white rice. It's just like, which I don't have a problem with brown rice, but if you're diabetic, like you shouldn't be like saying add copious amounts of carbohydrate. It just doesn't make sense to me. It didn't make sense to me at the time either. So I did learn the ropes, and I did have to kind of learn some of the research behind that. And I knew how to read a paper, just given the work that I was in. Like I knew how to read a research paper, even though that wasn't where my educational background was in. I had to learn. So the point is that, understanding the blood sugar piece made a big difference. I understood that like if I would spike and crash and all this, that I would probably get hungry.
So now after, now 3-point-something million on YouTube and people following you and practicing, what have you seen over the years of, again, for people who have excess weight, and then we'll get to the next category and group, do you recommend that the 16-8 is the best way for them to get introduced into intermittent fasting if they want to use it as a tool?
I think for getting started, it's the easiest, lowest barrier to entry for people to get familiar with it and become comfortable with it. So I do think that if someone is like fresh off the street, never fasted before, never gone more than 10 or 12 hours without eating, they feel like their face is going to fall off if they fast longer than 12 hours, then yes, I think starting with 16 hours is a great place to start, because arguably the benefits don't really start kicking in until, 15, 16 hours anyway. But at least if they get to 16 hours, they prove to themselves that they can get to that point. And it doesn't take long before people do that and say, oh, I can go longer. Should I go longer? So although I don't think that we should be doing 16-8 every day for extended periods of time, and I can explain why, I do think that it's a great entry point for people.
Yeah. Could you explain why?
Yeah. At the risk of, you end up putting yourself in the same category as basic caloric restriction. Not saying that intermittent fasting is not caloric restriction, because it most likely is for most people. But even in a lot of studies where things are matched for calories between caloric restriction and intermittent fasting, a lot of times we end up seeing the intermittent fasting group eating the same amount of calories as caloric restriction group. That's maybe eating 3 square meals a day, 8 a.m., 2 p.m., 8 p.m. or something. And magically, quote unquote, the intermittent fasting group will have the same amount of weight loss, but have better biomarkers. They'll have better glucose, better HbA1c, better inflammatory markers. Like, how do you explain that other than the fact that maybe is some extra benefit to abstaining from food for extended periods of time? Not denying the fact that caloric restriction was still at play. It's just, how are you going about that caloric restriction? Intermittent caloric restriction throughout the day by having multiple meals, or caloric restriction in a big, nice bolus of not eating for 16 hours. Maybe that's activating more of the processes, right? Point is that if you just do that every single day, eventually your body gets accustomed to that and it becomes the norm. And then it's not really different anymore. Then fasting does need to be looked at with the lens of it being a hormetic stressor, which means that fasting probably works so well because it is such a shock to the system. It is so different. And it's so different from what most people do for the entirety of their lives that they get a lot of benefits, especially in the beginning. But you find that people that do 16-8 every single day for years, they feel great, they love it, but maybe their weight loss plateaus. So if it works for a lifestyle and you just enjoy how you feel, but you're not trying to do anything else, then by all means, don't change it. But if you've reached this plateau, which most people do, it's probably because your basal metabolic rate has adjusted, just because it does. Your metabolism is going to adjust to the amount of calories that you take in. And if you are doing 16-8 every day and just eating the same amount of calories roughly, but the only difference is you're skipping breakfast, your body's going to adjust to that. And the benefits of fasting start to kind of diminish. So I typically recommend, like, especially once you've been doing it for a while, shift it up to slightly longer fasts a little less frequently. You know, try doing an 18 or 20 hour fast 3 days per week. That's more like what I do these days. That way it remains a shock to my system. That way it remains the quote unquote stressor that I want it to be, where it doesn't become just the norm.
Going back to people plateauing is also one of the things that you were hinting at, especially in this world where even wellness products have become, you know, hyper palatable, and there's all these like great treats and keto treats and other things that are out there, is that if somebody is plateauing, one reason could be that, as you mentioned, you know, they need a different stressor on their body, but also that people are really bad in general about tracking how many calories or understanding how many calories they're eating. So that if somebody says, kind of like you were saying, hey, I've tried everything and intermittent fasting is the only thing that worked for me. There's also stories that I hear about, hey, I've been doing intermittent fasting and it worked great in the beginning and it kind of stopped working. Could one of the things that people have to look at be, hey, are you just still over consuming on calories even though you're practicing intermittent fasting?
Yes, 1,000,000%. And that ends up being a lot of the issue. You know, I usually say that's the first thing that people should look at. I mean, before trying to adjust anything else or play with fasting length and things like that, just take a minute and take a few days and log and just see. I mean, you don't have to do it for the rest of your life. I know it's unrealistic to track for a lot of people, but you know, you can use an app for a little bit and just see where you are. And you might find that, well, shoot, I'm eating more with intermittent fasting than I am with, you know, regular caloric restriction, especially when people start combining keto with fasting. Because as much as I love keto, we got to remember that fats are very calorically dense and it's very easy to overeat on keto. And there's these misnomers out there that, like, because you're doing keto, you're granted all this amnesty from calories. That is not the truth. Like, it still matters. And fats store very easily as fat. Common kind of misconception is that fat burns fat. That's put out there as sort of a colloquialism, like eat fat to burn fat. And I understand where that's coming from. I've even said it myself, but that's not literal truth. Like, fat doesn't burn fat. Fat stores as fat quite easily because it doesn't have to go through different enzymatic processes to store as adipose tissue. So when you take someone that's doing like a higher fat diet along with intermittent fasting and they've got a compressed eating window, like, there's a good chance they're just adding in way too many calories, particularly as fat during that period of time. And next thing you know, they're like, oh, shoot, I'm eating 3,500 calories. Yeah, no wonder you're gaining weight. So we do need to kind of check ourselves with that. You know, there's good apps, like, as much as, you know, Lane Norton is kind of an opponent of fasting in many ways. Like, he's also created, you know, he's got his like Carbon app, which I think is great. It's not a plug for it. It's just, it kind of algorithmically adjusts based on like your body weight and stuff. That's kind of cool. So there's tools out there for people to just be like, hey, I don't need to track my food forever, but I can do it for a week and kind of get a glimpse of where I'm at.
So many people know that fasting is so powerful. They've heard about the science. They know it can do wonders for the body. But my question is, even with all that, why do some people not pursue fasting? Why do they not jump into the deep end and get started?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it's limiting beliefs. We've been so conditioned by society that we need to eat snacks and mini meals that the concept of going longer periods in between eating, it seems a little bit daunting. And I think on a lot of levels, even though there's all this growing awareness and growing bodies of research about metabolic health and strategies such as fasting that can be so critically important for ensuring we have, you know, incredible longevity, I think it really stems from the issues related to kind of a scarcity mindset or this overwhelm, I think it also really reflects the fact that, for many of us, we have a complicated relationship with food, meaning for many people, they eat beyond just I'm hungry. They eat for comfort. And certainly the last 2.5 years, we've all lived through unprecedented amounts of stress. We've been disconnected from loved ones. Maybe, our job roles have changed. Our children, we're evolving, trying to support our children and extended families. And so I also think there's this complex in a relationship with food, and food is not just fuel for many people. Food is a source of comfort. And I do believe fervently that a lot of people have made it through the last 2.5 years by, working on their feelings. And in many ways, they've created opportunities where they've been eating throughout the day and eating hyperpalatable, highly processed foods. And so I would imagine that those are two large contributors. And just, the analysis paralysis. There are also people who are well-intentioned and have a desire to lean into eating less often, and they just get stuck in overthinking things. And fasting doesn't have to be complicated, but many, many people make it more complicated than it needs to be because of this, again, the social conditioning of overthinking everything. And I think for every person who finds really high quality research, there'll be some cruddy research that's out there that, completely contradicts the message that someone else is trying to share. And so I do find on a daily basis trying to defend the position of fasting. But I think those are definitely three contributors to why people may not have yet embraced that strategy or really, ingrained it into their day-to-day or week-to-week schedules.
As a champion of fasting, when you sit down, and I know you're not in clinical practice at the moment right now, but really I would argue that you kind of are in clinical practice. You're like getting people excited. It just is on the web and other things. It's not one-on-one patient. But when you're sitting with someone, even at a cocktail party or somewhere, a dinner, and you're really sharing the elevator pitch around fasting and why you fast, what are some of the highlights of some of the things that you're mentioning to them?
Oh, I always talk about, especially at the stage of life that I'm in, having more energy, having a lot of energy, because your body's not focused on breaking down and assimilating food and nutrients. I think about cognition. I mean, gosh, who doesn't want to feel more mentally sharp, irrespective of what life stage you're in? And then also thinking, so, when we really understand the research between autophagy, which is this waste and recycling process that gets upregulated when we're in an unfed state and lessens our likelihood of developing certain types of chronic diseases that we think of as being completely natural. How many of us believe that high blood pressure and diabetes are just part of the aging process or significant weight gain? And then beyond that, when I'm doing the elevator pitch, I talk about the fact that, I feel much younger than I am chronologically. And I do credit a great deal of that to being able to maintain a very healthy, lean body habitus. And, the changes to body composition related to intermittent fasting are undeniable. But I would say that the changes in energy, the mental clarity are two of the big selling points from my perspective, because how many people assume it's normal to get to be 35, 40, 45, 50 or beyond, and you're tired all the time and you're weight loss resistant and you're feeling really inflamed, chronic joint pain or any of these other chronic health issues that seem to be the mainstay for most people that are at the life stage I'm in. So that's usually what I choose to focus on. And I find that, those three key areas for a lot of people make it even more intriguing. They're like, oh, I hadn't thought about that.
What's interesting is that you used energy was one of the first things you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And as I look out in society today and questions that come into the podcast that people want to have our guests cover, like yourself, people are often looking for what is this external thing that will give me energy? They don't necessarily think of energy as being attributed to not having something potentially like fasting. So help people understand that of how does that make sense, that how could not having food or eating less, and we'll break down all the details of the type of fasting that you talk about and how to do it, but how could not have something actually be a contributor to giving your body energy?
Such a good question. When we think about what drives energy in the body, we're really talking about organelles, mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of our cells. And by the age of 40, most of us have some degree of dysfunctional mitochondria, which contributes to the fatigue and chronic health issues that we see. But when I explain to people that most of us, if we're eating snacks and mini meals, we're not able to effectively utilize different types of fuel substrates. So our body isn't able to effectively use both glucose and fatty acids and potentially ketones, versus when we eat less often, it forces our body to use fuel much more efficiently. So our body can use, if we're being chased by a rabid animal, can use glucose as a fuel substrate, but it can also tap into stored fat. And even thin people have plenty of stored fat, which can be broken down into fatty acids and certain types of ketones, in particular beta hydroxybutyrate, which actually diffuses across the blood-brain barrier in an unfed state, can provide a really effective energy source for brain cells. So when we understand that we want our bodies to be metabolically flexible, because this can help improve energy, is really understanding that metabolic flexibility is highly dependent on meal frequency and being able to effectively utilize stored fat as a fuel source. And so understanding that fats and ketones in particular really potentiate this energy source. This is why people can work out in an unfed state when they're fat adapted. People have the ability to be very cognitively astute going through their day in an unfed state until they choose to break their fast. And so on a very, very simple level, it's understanding that metabolic flexibility is what provides that additional energy, and people feeling like they're much more energetic. When people say to me, I feel like I have more energy at 50 than I did at 35. And I always say that's the beauty of metabolic flexibility.
Metabolic flexibility is something that our audience has gotten a chance to get to know more about that phrase over the last few years. My business partner, Dr. Mark Hyman, he wrote a book, many years ago called The Blood Sugar Solution. And inside of that, he, didn't use that phrase, but he's talking about what it looks like to get your body in that state. But that phrase specifically, metabolic flexibility, thanks to people like Dr. Casey Means, people like yourself, Ben Bickman, individuals that we've had on the podcast, people are becoming a lot more aware. But still, I would say, just kind of like with fasting, there might be some people that are listening that don't fully understand what that looks like. So let's use a contrast. What are some top signs that you could share? Symptoms, reactions, other stuff, habits in people's lives that are a good indication that they're not metabolically flexible? Are there things that they're doing or feeling throughout the day that shows that they may not have metabolic flexibility? And by the way, metabolic flexibility is a good thing. So you're going to share with us the signs that maybe somebody is not in that place right now.
Absolutely. I would think first and foremost, when you eat a meal and you get hungry 1 to 2 hours later, that's a sign that you're either not fueling your body effectively or you're not particularly fuel efficient. I also think about the people that get hangry. So they're hungry, but they're getting grumpy, kind of like a toddler. I could also make the argument kind of like a teenager, because I have a few of those in my house as well. But those hangry episodes are a sign that your body is not effectively utilizing fats as a stored form of fuel. People that have stubborn weight loss resistance because their body is not metabolically well adapted. The people that say to me, I'm doing all the right things and I can't lose weight, more often than not, it's because their body is stuck, whether it's leptin or insulin resistance. And I'm sure we'll probably touch on some of these things. That can be a major contributor. I also think about, people that can't go more than 2 to 3 hours in between a meal. And it's because they're utilizing that fast, quick source of glucose or carbohydrates for fuel, and they're not able to tap into the fats. And so those are some of the key, most common things that I see. But it's also that fatigue. If you eat a meal and you're really tired after eating, that's not normal. That is a sign that either you didn't put your macros, your protein, fat, and carbohydrates together, but could also be a sign of not being metabolically flexible. And unfortunately, I think in our society, we think it's normal to get tired after eating a meal or to feel like we've eaten a good sized meal and we want to continue eating. It's almost like those satiation cues are off, which is super common to see some degree of leptin resistance. But if you keep wanting to eat after eating a good sized meal, that can also be a sign that you're not in a position where you're metabolically optimized.
And having your training and background as a nurse practitioner, can you share with us, just for the people that are following along, what might be some biomarkers that are also an indication where you can see it in your blood work that you haven't stepped into metabolic flexibility?
I would say first and foremost, a fasting insulin. I think it's the first biomarker that becomes dysregulated in some degree of insulin resistance way before fasting glucose or an A1C. And they do have their place. But I think if we were looking at more fasting insulins, we would be discovering more people who are heading in the wrong direction. I also think about triglycerides and HDL. We know that part of this metabolic syndrome are triglycerides that are greater than 150, HDL if you're a male, less than 45, women if they're less than 55. And what's interesting is every time I would work, and my whole background as an NP is in cardiology, so 16 years working with some very sick patients, and I would look at a triglyceride and it was 500, 300. And I would say, you have a carbohydrate problem. And they would say, no. And I would say, generally the people that have got genetic propensities for high triglycerides, it's exceedingly high, and that puts them at risk for pancreatitis. But that was definitely a barometer which I would use. I would say, okay, we need to clean up the carbohydrates because you're not getting this from eating too much meat. You're not getting this from eating too many vegetables. This is clearly processed carbohydrates, alcohol, etc. Those are three that I think about. I think about high sensitivity CRP. I certainly lean into some of the other biophysical markers. We're looking at fasting glucose, certainly uric acid. I know that Dr. David Perlmutter's really kind of highlighted this area in particular as being a metabolic health marker. How many people have gout? Or my patients in Baltimore used to call it gouch, which I thought was so cute, that really have these issues related to too high uric acid levels. And we're not talking to our patients about the fact that this is a sign that your insulin is way too high. I also think about just having, a blood pressure that's not within a proper range is a sign of some degree of insulin resistance. Those are the ones I tend to focus in on. I mean, obviously you can get with some degree of insulin resistance, you can get changes in your sex hormones. There are other things that go on, but fasting insulin is one that I talk about all the time because it is such an inexpensive test. And far too many allopathic trained providers are not looking at this measure. And I think it's criminal, because if we really want to get ahead of metabolic health issues, we have to start doing a better job of monitoring and prevention, as opposed to waiting until someone has, documented disease, waiting until they actually have a chronic health issue. Let's be much more preventative. So those are the ones that I typically focus in on.
And because you really highlighted fasting insulin as the first one, do you have a range where when somebody, first of all, it's kind of sad, but a lot of people you have to kind of maybe fight a little bit. And I don't mean that in advocate, I guess is the better word, because not always, unless if there's something immediately where you are screened or have a history of diabetes in your family, or you are clearly sort of diabetic or pre-diabetic, you kind of have to push your practitioner to order this lab for you. As you mentioned, it's not expensive, but when people do convince or work with one of these direct lab companies, which it's great that there's more of them that are out there, and let's say that they get their number back, what general range are you thinking about when it comes to fasting and insulin as they start to work towards more optimal numbers?
Yeah, I do like to see it between 2 and 5. And more often than not, a women will come to me and they'll say, I've been weight loss resistant for a period of time. I don't understand why this is happening. And all their other values don't look too bad, labs that they've done through their healthcare professional. And then I'll say, well, let's do a fasting insulin. And their fasting insulin's 20. And I'm like, well, now we understand. And so now we need to work very, very diligently, or a fasting insulin of 15 or a fasting insulin of 12. And I just say it gives us something to work towards objectively. And I really congratulate the healthcare practitioners who are now starting to order this test in particular, because we could be monitoring patients for years way ahead and, saying to them, okay, your fasting insulin's been 5 for 5 years and now it's 10. We need to do something differently so that we can lower this, understanding that it is oftentimes a biomarker. And I've had conversations with a lot of physicians who believe it's 5 to 10 years preceding becoming, officially insulin resistant or diabetic. And, given the lack of metabolic flexibility in our general population, this should be something that is monitored several times a year, monitored with, lifestyle changes, et cetera. But I really think that this is an inexpensive way to get a sense. It's like a litmus test, really, to get a sense of where someone is. How much work do we need to do? Do we have to be aggressive? Or can we say, okay, it's a little bit of tweaking, maybe a little bit of fasting, lower carbohydrate. Let's take a walk after dinner or your big meals. Let's focus on sleep. All things that are so important, but yet we're not consistently talking about these things enough. I think, the traditional kind of allopathic model, which I was trained in, many people, they're bucking up against so many changes in the healthcare system that they just don't feel like they have time to do one more thing. It feels onerous and overwhelming.
So it's such a profound thing of what you just shared. So I just want to make sure that our audience has those dots connected. So can you firmly connect the dots between, if you have an elevated fasting insulin, right, out of that range that you mentioned, and many people are way out of that range that you mentioned, they're in their 15, 20 and above. How does that make it difficult to lose weight?
So when your fasting insulin levels are high, your body cannot go in and draw upon fats as a fuel source. So it's almost like there's a lock and key mechanism that has been disrupted. So when as an example, we're in a fasted state and our insulin levels are low, our body can go in and can draw upon those fatty acids and utilize them as a fuel substrate. But if your fasting insulin is high, either because you eat constantly, and let's be frank, we've been telling our patients for years, eat 3 meals a day and snacks, and, eat to stoke your metabolism, and, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. What we're forgetting is that every time we're eating, depending on what we're eating, we can get either a significant blood sugar rise or maybe a minimal one. And important to probably note here that we're going to get a much greater response from blood sugar and insulin secreted to bring that blood sugar back down. If you're eating all carbohydrates, it's very different than eating some protein and healthy fats, which are going to have a more negligible impact on that blood sugar response. So understanding that meal frequency, chronic stress, understanding that if you're getting poor quality sleep, all of these things can mitigate that. But the big takeaway is, if your fasting insulin's high, guess what? You are not going to be metabolically flexible. It is hormonally you are hormonally incapable of drawing upon those stored fats as a fuel source. And really important to understand that there are ways we can work around this. There's never been a patient that I've worked with who's had a high insulin that we haven't been able to fix. But more often than not, that knowledge is power. But it's understanding on a fundamental level, fasting insulin needs to be low to be able to utilize it effectively. It's not a bad hormone. It gets a bad rap, unfortunately. We think about insulin resistance, and that's all we always say. It's a negative thing. And I always say insulin is a beautiful hormone when it's properly balanced. And all these hormones, it's almost like there's a great symphony. We need to properly balance these hormones. And much of that can be adjusted by simply changing our lifestyle.
Yeah, it's so important to remember these things that we feel like we want to demonize play a super important role in the body, even things like plaque, right? And obviously we know the cholesterol story, and we've talked about that. What was really interesting, and I know you're familiar with his work and he's been on this podcast before, but Ben Bickman was saying that there are 2 times in our life where our body actually goes into insulin resistance to support us. One of them is, and you mentioned you have teenagers in the house, one is during puberty. Insulin is a major part of helping us rapidly grow, in the case of women, to develop, breast and their hips and everything else. For young men, also just growing rapidly, being a part of that process, that sort of insatiable appetite, which is part of that process of stepping into it. And then the other one, which if I understand correctly, was also when it's a baby is going through it, or is it when a mother's pregnant? Either way, I'll look back up and I'll write that inside of the show notes. Maybe do you know the other time that the body actually purposely goes into insulin resistance?
Well, I think it's a very delicate balance, during pregnancy, because you don't want insulin resistance that's then fueling gestational diabetes.
Totally.
But I being the parent of teenagers, especially male teenagers, I can assure you that anabolic massive growth phase, the amount of food that their bodies can intake in a meal, let alone over the course of 24 hours, is quite impressive.
So let's zoom back out to fasting, because really the other dots that we're connecting through your work and that you've highlighted in your book. It's there in the background for the people that are watching: intermittent fasting transformation, the 45-day program for women to lose stubborn weight, improve hormonal health, and slow aging. So to connect the dots with fasting and metabolic health and improving metabolic flexibility, fasting is one of the primary levers that you've used both as a practitioner and now in your teaching to help people step into optimal metabolic health. So how do you look at the world of fasting? Fasting can mean a lot of different things. And is there a particular type of fasting that you recommend for most people?
Yeah, I mean, fasting is as simple as saying eat less often. I think it's very triggering for some people to say. The word fasting can be very triggering. And so I always say that the beauty of fasting is it's flexible. We don't have to do the same eating and feeding window and fasting window on a daily basis. I do lean into a 16-8 as a good starting point. Obviously, there are lots of variations, but I do find that the average person, when they're new to fasting and we're working our way up to 16 hours fasted with an 8-hour feeding window, is a good starting point. Obviously, there are people that engage and advocate for longer fasts, and people are doing shorter fasts. But for the average person that's listening, that's trying to, wrap their heads around, I'm going to go 16 hours without eating, it's understanding most of that time is spent sleeping. That's the one thing for many people. They don't realize you're actually sleeping, 8, 9, 10 hours a day, or you've stopped eating and you're heading to bed. And it really isn't as arduous as people anticipate it will be. I know that even myself, I had a healthy amount of skepticism at first. And then I started doing it. So really it's eating less often and understanding that feeding and that fasting window are very flexible. So obviously men and menopausal women can fast differently than women that are still getting a menstrual cycle. And that's an area of my work because it hasn't really been focused in on very much in most others' work. But I think that fasting is really as simple as eating less often. And it's not new or novel. That's unfortunately one of those things that the media really wants us to believe, that it's new and novel and it's just like, a fad and a phase. And I have to remind them that it dates back to biblical times. All the major religions have incorporated some degree of fasting into their practices. And so it is not new. It may be new to us because we've been conditioned otherwise by, I want to believe, well-meaning clinicians and probably the media. But our bodies actually are adapted to be able to eat less often. We have trained them otherwise, though.
When people hear it, they're often facing against all the marketing advice that they see out there in the world. You hinted at that a little bit earlier, but I think it's just worthwhile touching on for a second. Why are the powers that be, and I don't mean that in a conspiratorial way, I think economics is often the primary driver of things, but why is the powers that be, and how did we get so entrenched in this idea that we have to eat regularly and somehow that will help us have a better metabolism or will help us keep up our metabolism?
Yeah, well, the processed food industry is ultimately there to make a profit. And so if you look at the trajectory of the processed food industry over the last 100 years, last 80 years, we went from, as a society, largely eating a substantive breakfast, whether it's bacon and eggs, whether it's leftover steak, whatever it is that we're eating, because people actually needed to have a real hearty breakfast because they weren't going to eat again till lunch, or maybe they didn't eat again till later in the afternoon or evening. And we slowly transitioned to eating a lot of grain products. Obviously, things that are subsidized by the federal government really proliferate in the processed food industry, and grains are a large part of that. And we went from eating, protein and healthy fats to eating a lot of carbohydrate. And so whether it's cereal or granola or sugar sweetened beverages or, the sugar sweetened yogurt that's out there, we've shifted away from being protein focused to being carbohydrate focused. And we went from having a substantive meal and not being hungry for 4 or 5 hours to eating a poultry meal with not a lot of nutritional value that is not going to keep our blood sugar stable, that is going to create a degree of potential insulin resistance, and is not going to give us the cognitive ability to be able to focus for hours on end. We're going to get hungry an hour or two later. And this is where I think the notion started, was we started changing the way we were eating. We started eating much more processed foods. And it's interesting, my grandparents, my grandfather was Italian, my grandmother was German. And they used to talk to me quite a bit because food is very important in Italians' lifestyles. And so they would talk to me about what they were watching from an evolution perspective over the past 50 plus years. And they used to talk about, like, people used to grow gardens and people used to, spend a lot of time making meals. And I think the processed food industry stepped in after World War II and really started to convince people, like, oh, if you buy these products, they're going to help you stay out of the kitchen. You're not going to have to spend as much time. People started getting disconnected from the process of cooking. People started feeling dependent on these processed foods to be able to create quote unquote nutritious meals for their families. So I think there's many things that changed that contributed to this. But when I think about the processed food industry as a whole, they've introduced products to make our lives easier. But in essence, these same products have made us less healthy. So we're convinced we don't know how to cook. We're convinced that meals should be prepared in 5 minutes. We've convinced ourselves that we should eat on the go, all these convenience foods. Think about it when you travel, go to an airport, there's very rarely, at least where I seem to go through, there aren't always healthy options while you're traveling. And so when I think about all the things that have contributed to this mindset that we've gotten disconnected from the way our bodies are designed to, fervently thrive. And instead we are focused on quick fixes, believing that, the limiting beliefs that we don't need to be cooking, or that these things are going to be healthier than what we could create in our own home. And we're kind of heading down a path where young people don't know how to cook, and they're convinced that they want to go through the fast food line because that's going to be more convenient. But more often than not, the processed foods that they're consuming are contributing to insulin resistance and poor metabolic health. I posted something on social media the other day about Chick-fil-A. And it was showing what the ingredients were in the bun and the chicken and the seasonings. And most of it was seed oils and a lot of, hydrogenated products that no one should be eating. And people are understanding now that oftentimes when you're consuming these hyper palatable foods, you want more and more and more, because it dysregulates these key, hormonal mechanisms in the body that remind us we're full, as opposed to sitting down and having a steak and maybe you have some broccoli, and then maybe you're having something else with your meal and you feel full and satiated because your body can recognize what those macronutrients are. So I think many things have contributed to this. Certainly I always say that if you start your day with, processed carbs, you're definitely not setting yourself up in the right foot or the right frame of mind to be able to get through your day and have enough energy and feel like you're going to be able to tackle whatever the day throws at you.
What I love about your message and how you break things down is, number one, you're a great storyteller, and I just want to acknowledge you for that. You really help people kind of connect the dots and see what was happening in the past versus now. Another thing that you do that I think is very needed in today's world of health and wellness is that you hear a few different things when it comes to this topic of, you were just chatting about breakfast, right? So on one side, let's call it the traditional TV advertising, the old model. It's like breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And within that context, it's, you need to have your cereal, you need to have your donut, bagel, whatever. They just looking at it from a standpoint of calories in, calories out, get that external energy that's there, right? Then you have another side of, let's call it, some of the health trends that we've been seeing where people are like, skip breakfast. It's completely unnecessary. Just fast and go right into whatever you need to do for the day. And, there's no reason to have that component, which, okay, there might be a lot of individuality and sometimes that works great for individuals, especially when they've tapped into metabolic flexibility. But this other area that you kind of highlight in the middle, which is that it's not that breakfast is bad or good. The question is, what are you fueling yourself with? And how does that set the tone for what's going on, especially when you're in this transitionary phase of getting your body from not metabolically flexible to more metabolically flexible. So that often means, did you have a really tough workout the day before? Do you have a lot of cognitive activities? There's a lot of layers that you're balancing out. We don't want to just rule things out completely. Well, we know that traditional story that we see on TV, that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, so just eat as much as sugar and carbs as you want. We know that that's not true because we could just look around and see that it's not working. But there's these other sides where people can have a little bit of variation. So help us unpack that variation. And is there any variation specifically on the topic of breakfast that you teach your clients and that your coaches teach the people that they're working with?
It's such a good way to think about this. And I'm going to disclose this to you up front. So today is one of those very busy days. I had a very heavy leg day yesterday. I woke up this morning and I was hungry. My day is so busy that I knew I was not going to have an opportunity to eat in between all the things that I'm doing. And so I got up this morning and I ate breakfast. And I think most people would be surprised to know that. But I think that when you get to a point, when you acknowledge where you are in time and space, when you look at your schedule and you say to yourself, I would rather sit down and have a real nutrient dense whole foods diet meal than fast really long today. Because I can tell you right now, like when I'm that hungry when I wake up, I know it's that my body's looking for me personally, I need to eat. I'm going to get that protein bolus in, and then I will make it through all of my things I need to do on my calendar. But when I'm working with women in particular, if I'm working with my coaches, I always tell them, first of all, our bodies, if we lean into our intuitive side of our bodies, and for many people, if you're not metabolically healthy, that's challenging. So let me just preface that. But when you're in a point where you are metabolically flexible, I think those cues, sometimes you don't sleep well. Sometimes you had a really tough workout. Maybe you're stressed. Maybe you didn't eat enough the day before because you just had a busy day. And that does happen. It really genuinely happens. Not to my teenagers, but it does happen to me on occasion. That might be a day where you're not going to fast as long. You may get up in the morning and say, I've done a 15-hour fast already. I'm ready to eat. And you need to intuitively lean into what your body is trying to share with you. I think on the other end, we have to acknowledge that we as women, if we're still getting menstrual cycles, there are going to be times during our cycles when we're going to have greater success with fasting than in others. I think it's important to acknowledge that if you're not sleeping, that's not a time to fast. And I'm sure you probably have had other guests on that have talked about hormesis and hormetic stress and how this is so important, beneficial stress in the right amount at the right time. Intermittent fasting is a type of hormesis. And so it might be you have too much on your plate, and that is okay. So what I always say is a gold standard for everyone, unless you are growing, like you are a teenager, like my teenagers don't fast. Pregnant people, breastfeeding people should not fast. But one thing I like to emphasize is that everyone can benefit from 12 hours of not eating. Really and truly, like that should be the gold standard for everyone. And I don't consider that per se fasting, but that's 12 hours of digestive rest, which has incredible health benefits. And that should be the gold standard that we're teaching our patients and we're talking to people about. So when I talk about fasting and really leaning into bio-individuality, it's asking yourself all of those questions: sleep, stress, life circumstances, where you are in your menstrual cycle, where you are in life stage, and understanding it is okay to adjust. We don't have to be rigid. That's one thing about fasting that I always like to emphasize is how important it is to not be rigid. One of the key proponents of fasting from my perspective is flexibility. So you may fast 5 days out of the week and say on the weekends, I don't want to fast, and that's okay. Or you may fast 2 weeks out of your menstrual cycle and say, I don't want to fast the last 2 weeks of my menstrual cycle. Or a male could say, I don't want to fast on the days I'm lifting really heavy. And that's okay. But I think the gold standard should really be, can you get enough protein into your feeding window? Where are you life stage? And what is your lifestyle like at that given point in time? All of those things can really impact the success that you embrace with fasting.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
It becomes very difficult to sleep as we get older. And when we don't sleep, we are more prone to eating late at night and getting exposed to light. That itself pushes us into a vicious cycle.